The Holy Gospel is written in the 14th chapter according to St. Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
Now when Jesus heard about the beheading of John the Baptist, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And there were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The Gospel of the Lord. A couple of pieces of background before we get into the message itself is, isn't it interesting that they said about 5,000 men? Now we know that mostly men wrote the Bible, as far as we know, and men were the ones that were being counted, not the women and children. So there were probably at least 10,000 people present. 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed them. A miracle beyond miracles, in my opinion. One of the things that I have dreamed of last week was I would come in with a huge basket full of loaves of bread to pass out to everybody. And then I got company, so that didn't happen. Maybe next time. This gospel comes around every now and then. But a little more background, just to kind of set the tone and to have in the back of your mind. I did just a quick little research, really quick research, and I know that you can find different numbers depending on what you look up and how you look it up. But there was a 24-year study from 1999 to 2023. I was looking for how many incidents of starvation or how many medically related mortalities were there that were related somehow to malnutrition. So in those 24 years, in the United States, there were 156,117 deaths. In this United States. Now it's 24 years, so that's not so many each year, but there shouldn't be one. I don't know how many of those were children. But I do know that in worldwide hunger, they claim that those kind of deaths, about 45% of all the world's deaths related to starvation, hunger, malnutrition of people, they are about 45% are under the age of 5. Unbelievable. Another study related to that says that 3 million children die every year from starvation. I cannot get my head around that. I had to read the numbers 2 or 3 times. That doesn't seem like that's even possible. And that 45 million children every year suffer from acute malnutrition annually. Just unbelievable, unbelievable. Because what we know is it's not a matter of not having food. It's not a food problem, it's a people problem. How do we get the food and get it to the children that need it? Who pays for the transportation? We've, in my lifetime, dumped thousands and thousands of gallons of milk. You may remember that. It's been quite a few years. And we destroy food. And I understand just this last year, the Dole Company kind of went out of business in California. They couldn't find people to pick the peaches or the people to take care of them in the cannery. And so they destroyed the entire orchards. And yet there are starving children in our own country. And how we get to that worldwide, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for it, because we know that corrupt governments will take the food that they're given and sell it for their own purposes. It's a people problem, not a matter of not having enough food. Now that's a terribly negative piece of information, but I want that in the back of our minds, because we need to think about, are there some things that we can do about that somehow? I know that you have at one time been involved in a backpack, food packing for weekends for kids to take home from at the end of school, so they had something over the weekend. I'm not sure that they got all that food when they got it home, but it was an attempt. And you have a basket that you put food in, and it goes to the food pantry, and you serve at the homeless shelter every couple of months. So you are doing things to try to help, and that's beautiful. So now, all that, set it in the back. Let's take another little approach. There is something exciting about someone finding a previously undiscovered treasure. We know from last week's gospel, treasures abound. There was a pearl of great price. There was a treasure in a field. There were wonderful things being found everywhere. Well, King Duncan tells a story about an Air Force veteran who bought a Rolex watch that turned out to be an astounding investment. And we know that works of art can be the same thing. In September, a few years ago, a French woman took an old painting to an auction house to find out what it was worth. It had been hanging in her kitchen over top of a hot plate, or just on the wall behind the hot plate. But someone had told her, you better go have that appraised. So she did. The evaluator recognized the old painting. It depicts Jesus being mocked before his crucifixion. Turns out it was painted in 1280 by an Italian painter, a forefather of the Italian Renaissance, and the painting that had been hanging over this hot plate sold at an auction for $26.8 million. Glad it didn't fall into the frying fat, after all. A brother and sister in the United Kingdom were cleaning out their parents' house, and they took some items to an auction house to be appraised. And one item was a vase, a big vase with a fish depicted on the front. And it turned out to have been something that was created for a Chinese emperor in the 18th century, and it sold for $18 million. Don't throw those old things away. But how can these amazing works of art go unnoticed for decades and centuries? It's because it takes someone with a special skill to see their worth. A trained art appraiser looked at them and saw a masterpiece. Two different people looking at exactly the same thing can see it vastly different. It's a matter of perspective. A woman named Siobhan tells about a friend of hers who teaches first grade in Toronto, Canada. The friend was teaching math to a class of 6-year-olds. You might identify with this, including a group of newly arrived refugee children. Now they're just 6, remember, they're just 6. The lesson that day was on fractions. I can't imagine 6-year-olds already doing fractions. But the teacher explained the difference between a quarter and a half in fractions. And then she asked the class to write down what was their preference, to have a quarter piece of a candy bar or a half of a candy bar. The teacher was surprised by the results. When she took the quiz and the papers in, She looked at their papers, but she noticed that most of her refugee students had written down they'd prefer a quarter of a chocolate bar. So before she graded it, she asked the children why did they prefer to have a quarter of a candy bar. And one little girl answered, so that more people could have a piece of chocolate. Good lesson in there. But two groups of children looked at the very same thing, a chocolate bar, and one group saw a delicious snack and the other saw an opportunity to share something good with others. It's all in what you see. So think about that important difference as we deal with our Bible passage, our gospel, for today. Jesus and his disciples traveled to a remote place. Crowds of people followed them, and if you count the men, the children, and the women, probably 10,000 or more, all of them wanting to be very close to Jesus. And obviously, they thought they might get something from him. And as the day passed, the disciples got tired. They asked Jesus to send the people away. It wasn't just a matter of fatigue. They were concerned that people wouldn't be able to find enough to eat in the surrounding countryside. But Jesus said the strangest thing. They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. Can you imagine being in the disciples' shoes? There was no Quick Trip close by. There was no Casey's close by, or even Ricketts. Where are they going to find that food? We need to understand that very often Jesus led his disciples into challenging situations that required courage and insight and radical faith. Situations that seemed way too big for what they were capable of, and this was no exception. Jesus saw something, though, that they didn't see. He saw the world through God's eyes. He saw a world in which almost anything was possible if you were tightly aligned with God. So let's begin here. Seeing the world as Jesus sees it begins with compassion. In computer terms, is compassion your default setting? When you look at the people around you, do you just automatically default to feelings of compassion? Jesus often led those disciples into very challenging situations, as I said, that required courage and insight and radical faith and things that just seemed way too big for them. A little shift. You're going to think I've lost my mind. We're going to talk about football for just a minute. Just shove it right in the middle here. If you're a fan, you may know the name Joe Burrow. Burrow led his team, the LSU Bengal Tigers, to a national championship in football. He also won the 2019 Heisman Trophy as the nation's most outstanding player. At the ceremony in which he accepted the trophy, he used that moment in the spotlight to talk about the children in his hometown back in Athens, Ohio. You might know also that Athens, Ohio is one of the poorest towns in the Appalachian region. Through tears, Burrow said, "I'm up here for all those kids in Athens County that go home to not much food on the table, and they're hungry already after school." And then he added, "You guys can be up here too." Within hours of Burrow's words, a man in Athens County named Will Draybold set up a fundraising site to raise money for the food pantry. He was counting on Joe's words of compassion to inspire others, and he was right. Curious fans began searching for information on this county, and within 2 days, they had donated $260,000 to that food pantry, all because they were moved by Burrow's compassion for needy kids in the community. Compassion is certainly Jesus' default setting, at the very core of Jesus' nature. It's the reason why he gave up his power and authority as part of the Godhead that took on human flesh and human weakness and walked among us. Jesus' compassion for us is what led him to die for us on the cross. It was the only way to save us from the sins and restore us to God. Now notice again the opening words to this story. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Do we remember what Matthew was referring to, what had just happened? It's important and tragic because Jesus had just found out that his cousin, John the Baptist, had been beheaded by King Herod. A horrendous thing to have happened to someone you love and admire. So Jesus undoubtedly wanted some time alone to grieve his cousin's death. But the needy crowds followed him to this lonely place that he went to grieve. They were desperate to hear his teaching and receive a healing touch. So at this point, most people, not Jesus, but most people would have gotten angry or annoyed. They would have told the disciples to send the people away. He would need some me time. But when Jesus looked at this crowd of thousands, he didn't see a crowd. There was a quote written years ago that the one thing God cannot do, God cannot see a crowd. He sees only individuals made in the image of God, and that's what Jesus saw. Not a crowd, but individuals who were immensely precious in God's sight. And he saw that they were hurting, and he had compassion on them, thousands of them. So when we operate from a place of compassion, we see others as God sees them, and suddenly we want to help. We want to heal, and we'll do whatever it takes because these people are valuable to God, and that makes them valuable to us. So when we look through Jesus' eyes, we say, Lord, my life belongs to you. I may not have much, but whatever I am and whatever I have, use it for your kingdom. And suddenly we see a million needs all around us, and we find a way to meet at least some of those needs. When we care enough, we will sacrifice what we have to make a difference, and you have, and you continue to do so. Here's the beautiful thing. Seeing the world through Jesus' eyes often leads to miracles being performed. One last little story. A little girl named Rachel Beckwith, she's not a celebrity, but she decided to donate her birthday monetary gifts with a goal of raising $300 for charity. Well, she raised $220. Didn't quite make the goal, but she was close. That's pretty good for a child. But just a few weeks after her 9th birthday, Rachel died in a car accident. News media across the country spread the story of this generous child and her tragic death, and strangers started making donations. Water is what the focus was, clean water in Rachel's honor. And at least at the last count, 1.3 million had been collected and donated. And that was enough money to provide clean water for 37,000 people. Rachel Beckwith saw the world with Jesus' eyes. She looked at the world with compassion, and instead of asking for presents for her birthday, she donated her birthday for others, a radical act of love and faith from a child. Her compassion inspired people all over the world to give enough to have clean water for 37,000 people. If that isn't a miracle like the miracle of feeding the 5 or the 10,000, I'd like to know what is. Now, Jesus was not planning a picnic on this day. He was training his disciples in seeing the world through his eyes and thereby establishing the kingdom of God on earth. And he's still doing that today. Because whenever you or I see a need, large or small, no matter how small our resources are, we are to bring them to Jesus And then we will see the miracle that he can do through us and through all those who see the world through Jesus' eyes. Amen.